When people ask me about my political position, they expect me to choose a side. Are you left or right? Progressive or conservative? The question itself reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what politics actually is. I refuse these categories not out of stubbornness, but because they represent the very death of political life itself. Both left and right politics operate from the same fatal assumption: that politics is about implementing an ideology, about governing people according to predetermined ideas about how society should function. But this is not politics at all. This is administration masquerading as political action. True politics begins precisely where these ideological programs end. During my years observing American political life, and through my earlier experience of statelessness in Europe, I witnessed how both sides reduce human plurality to abstract categories. Whether it's the right's appeal to natural order or the left's vision of historical necessity, both treat humans as though we were predictable objects rather than beings capable of surprising action. Today, we'll explore why genuine political life requires us to think without the banister of left-right categories, and how this conventional framework threatens the very conditions that make authentic politics possible. Chapter 1: The Ideological Trap: How Left and Right Destroy Political Thinking. The moment we accept the left-right framework, we surrender our capacity for political judgment. These categories function like intellectual straitjackets, forcing complex human realities into predetermined boxes that simply cannot contain them. I learned this firsthand when colleagues and critics persistently tried to classify my analysis of totalitarianism along these conventional lines. Consider how this framework operates. The right appeals to tradition, hierarchy, and natural order, while the left appeals to progress, equality, and historical necessity. Both share a crucial flaw: they subordinate human action to abstract principles. The conservative believes in preserving existing arrangements regardless of their merit, while the progressive believes in changing arrangements according to ideological blueprints. Neither leaves room for what I call spontaneous political action. When I analyzed the rise of totalitarianism, many expected me to blame either capitalism or socialism exclusively. But totalitarian movements draw supporters from across the political spectrum because they promise to transcend politics altogether through ideology. The Nazi movement attracted both former leftists and rightists who were willing to abandon political judgment in favor of a total worldview that explained everything. This is why I insist that totalitarianism is not simply an extreme form of left or right politics. It represents the destruction of politics itself. Totalitarian movements succeed precisely by offering certainty to people exhausted by the burden of political judgment. They promise to eliminate the need for citizens to think and act together by providing a complete interpretation of reality. The left-right framework prepares the ground for this destruction by teaching people to think in terms of competing ideologies rather than developing their capacity for political discrimination. When we reduce complex situations to ideological positions, we stop seeing the unique particulars that require fresh thinking and judgment. Both sides treat politics as a means to implement predetermined truths about human nature or historical development. But politics is not about implementing truth. It's about creating a common world where diverse human beings can act together despite their differences. The moment we subordinate this activity to ideological goals, we lose politics and gain only administration or violence. Chapter 2: The Social Question versus the Political Question. The most fundamental error of modern politics, whether left or right, lies in confusing the social question with the political question. Both sides approach politics as though its primary purpose were to solve social problems: poverty, inequality, economic organization. But this conflation represents a category mistake that undermines the possibility of genuine political life. The social question concerns how we organize our economic life, how we manage the necessities of biological existence, how we distribute resources. These are certainly important matters, but they belong to the realm of administration, not politics. Politics proper begins where these questions end, in the space where people come together not to solve problems, but to act in concert and create something new in the world. Throughout my years observing American democracy, I've noticed how both liberals and conservatives reduce political debates to social and economic issues. The left focuses on redistribution and social justice, the right on economic freedom and traditional values. Both miss the essential point. Politics is not primarily about managing society, but about creating and maintaining a public realm where citizens can appear before one another as unique individuals. When the French Revolution elevated the social question to political primacy, it marked a turning point in Western political thought. Suddenly, politics became about solving the problem of poverty and inequality rather than creating institutions for collective action. This shift, however well-intentioned, began the process of reducing citizens to members of social classes with predictable interests rather than treating them as unpredictable actors capable of transcending their circumstances. The left inherited this revolutionary tradition, making social justice the central political goal. But justice, properly understood, is not a political concept, it's a moral one. Politics begins where moral certainties end, in the realm where people must act together without predetermined guidelines. When we make justice the goal of politics, we eliminate the need for political judgment and reduce citizens to beneficiaries of correct policies. The right makes a different but equally fatal error by treating politics as the protection of existing social arrangements. Conservative politics becomes about preserving traditional hierarchies and economic systems rather than maintaining spaces for political action. This reduces politics to administration, managing society according to established patterns rather than allowing for genuine innovation. Both approaches treat human beings as essentially social creatures whose political life can be derived from their economic or cultural positions. But humans are political precisely insofar as they can transcend their social circumstances and act in ways that surprise both themselves and others. Politics requires the assumption that people are more than the sum of their social conditions. The tragedy of modern political life is that we've lost sight of this distinction between the social and political realms. We expect politics to solve social problems, and when it fails to do so, we blame either insufficient leftist redistribution or inadequate rightist freedom. But politics was never meant to solve the social question. Its purpose is to create and maintain the conditions under which free action remains possible. Chapter 3: The Problem of Ideology in Political Life. Ideology represents the death of political thinking, and both left and right politics are, at their core, ideological enterprises. An ideology claims to possess the key to understanding all of history and all of human action. It promises to eliminate the uncertainty and plurality that make political judgment necessary. This is precisely why I reject both traditional political positions. They ask us to stop thinking in favor of applying predetermined frameworks. During my analysis of totalitarian movements, I discovered that ideology functions by making everything logically consistent. Nazi racial ideology explained all of history through the lens of racial struggle, while Stalinist historical materialism explained everything through class conflict. Both eliminated the need for fresh thinking about particular situations because the ideology provided ready-made explanations for every phenomenon. Contemporary left and right politics operate with the same logical consistency. Liberal ideology explains political problems through the lens of inequality and oppression, providing predetermined solutions based on rights and redistribution. Conservative ideology explains the same problems through the lens of moral decline and institutional decay, offering solutions based on tradition and authority. Both eliminate the need for citizens to examine each situation on its own terms. But political situations are always unique. They require what I call thinking without banisters, the willingness to approach each circumstance fresh, without the comfort of ideological guidelines. When we encounter racism, for instance, ideological thinking immediately categorizes it as either a problem of individual prejudice requiring education or a systemic issue requiring structural change. But racism as a political phenomenon requires us to understand how it destroys the plurality that makes politics possible, an understanding that cannot be derived from either liberal or conservative ideology. The appeal of ideology lies in its promise to relieve us of the burden of judgment. Political judgment is difficult because it requires us to discriminate between particulars without universal criteria. We must decide how to act in specific circumstances without being able to derive our decisions from general principles. Ideology offers escape from this difficulty by providing universal explanations that eliminate the need for discrimination. Consider how ideological thinking handles the question of authority. The left rejects authority as inherently oppressive, while the right defends it as necessary for order. But authority in political life cannot be understood through these abstract positions. Legitimate authority emerges from common action and shared foundation, while illegitimate authority attempts to substitute force for consent. This distinction cannot be grasped ideologically, but requires careful attention to how authority actually functions in particular contexts. What makes this particularly dangerous is that ideology destroys our capacity to see when our principles conflict with reality. The ideological leftist cannot acknowledge when egalitarian policies undermine the conditions for political participation. The ideological rightist cannot see when traditional authorities have lost their legitimacy. Both become incapable of learning from experience because the ideology filters all experience through its predetermined categories. Politics requires the opposite of ideological thinking. It demands that we remain open to being surprised by human action, that we preserve our capacity to distinguish between different kinds of situations, and that we maintain our ability to act in ways that transcend our theoretical commitments. This is why genuine political life is incompatible with both left and right ideologies. Chapter 4. How both sides instrumentalize politics. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of left-right politics is how both sides treat political action as a means to predetermined ends rather than recognizing politics as valuable in itself. This instrumentalization destroys the essence of political life, which lies not in achieving specific goals, but in the experience of acting together with others in a public space. The left instrumentalizes politics for social transformation. Political action becomes a tool for achieving equality, justice, or liberation. But this reduces citizens to agents of historical change rather than recognizing them as beings who find meaning in the very act of political participation. When politics becomes instrumental to social goals, we lose sight of why humans need political life in the first place. Not to solve problems, but to actualize their capacity for freedom. The right instrumentalizes politics for social preservation. Political action becomes a means of protecting traditional values, maintaining order, or preserving established institutions. This approach treats politics as essentially defensive, missing how genuine political action always involves the creation of something unprecedented. Conservative instrumentalism reduces politics to administration, managing society according to proven formulas rather than allowing for genuine innovation. Both approaches share a fundamental misunderstanding of what I call the vita activa, the active life. They treat political action as work, as a means of fabricating desired social arrangements. But political action differs essentially from work because it does not aim to produce predetermined objects. Political action reveals who people are through their words and deeds, creating relationships and meanings that cannot be planned in advance. During my years observing American political movements, I noticed how activists on both sides measure success by policy outcomes rather than by the quality of political life itself. Progressive movements judge themselves by legislative achievements, laws passed, regulations implemented, social changes accomplished. Conservative movements measure success by elections won, judicial appointments made, traditional arrangements preserved. Both miss the intrinsic value of citizens coming together to deliberate and act in common. This instrumentalization explains why both left and right politics tend toward violence when they encounter resistance. If politics is merely a means to achieve social goals, then other means, including force, become acceptable when political persuasion fails. The left justifies violence as necessary for liberation, while the right justifies it as necessary for order. Both abandon politics for violence because they never valued political life for its own sake. True political action is characterized by what I call natality, the human capacity to begin something new. When people act together politically, they bring unprecedented possibilities into the world. But these possibilities cannot be planned or predicted. They emerge from the interaction between unique individuals who come together not to implement a program, but to explore what they might accomplish together. The instrumentalization of politics also explains why both sides become impatient with the messiness and unpredictability of democratic life. If politics is just a tool for achieving social goals, then the compromises, delays, and unexpected developments that characterize genuine political processes appear as obstacles to be overcome rather than as manifestations of human plurality. When we treat politics instrumentally, we inevitably end up disappointed. Social problems prove more complex than our ideologies suggested, and political action produces unexpected consequences that don't fit our original plans. This disappointment leads to cynicism about politics itself, when the real problem lies in our mistaken understanding of what politics is for. Chapter 5: The Loss of Political Judgment. The most profound consequence of left-right thinking is the atrophy of political judgment, that faculty by which citizens discriminate between better and worse courses of action without relying on predetermined criteria. Both ideological positions substitute rule following for judgment, teaching people to apply universal principles rather than developing their capacity to think about particular situations. Political judgment resembles aesthetic judgment more than logical deduction. When we judge a political situation, we cannot simply apply universal rules the way we might solve a mathematical problem. Instead, we must develop what I call political taste, the ability to distinguish between actions that enhance or diminish our common life together. This capacity can only be developed through participation in political life itself, not through adherence to ideological positions. Consider how left-right thinking handles the question of civil disobedience. The left tends to support it when it serves progressive causes, while the right tends to oppose it as undermining lawful authority. But political judgment requires us to examine each instance of civil disobedience on its own terms. Does it emerge from genuine political commitment or mere self-interest? Does it strengthen or weaken the political community? Does it respect the plurality of fellow citizens or attempt to impose a particular view? These questions cannot be answered through ideological formulas. They require the kind of discriminating attention that develops only through practice in political life. When we substitute left or right principles for this discriminating attention, we lose our capacity to respond appropriately to novel situations that don't fit our pre-existing categories. The danger of this loss becomes apparent when we face unprecedented challenges that cannot be addressed through conventional political positions. During my analysis of the Eichmann trial, I encountered a form of evil that fit neither traditional categories of wickedness nor standard explanations of criminal behavior. Eichmann's evil was banal. It emerged not from ideological commitment, but from thoughtlessness, from the abdication of judgment in favor of rule following. This banality of evil represents a distinctly modern phenomenon that ideological thinking cannot grasp. The left wants to explain Eichmann's actions through systemic analysis, capitalism, authoritarianism, oppression. The right wants to explain them through moral categories, individual choice, personal responsibility, traditional values. But Eichmann's case reveals something more troubling: the possibility that evil can emerge simply from the refusal to think, from the substitution of bureaucratic efficiency for moral and political judgment. Both left and right politics encourage this same substitution of rule following for thinking. They provide ready-made answers to complex questions, relieving citizens of the burden of judgment. But judgment cannot be delegated to ideological experts or derived from theoretical principles. It emerges only from the willingness to think about each situation fresh, to consider multiple perspectives, and to accept responsibility for our discriminations. The loss of political judgment has practical consequences for democratic life. Citizens who rely on ideological positions cannot recognize when their own side commits errors or when their opponents make valid points. They become incapable of the kind of nuanced evaluation that democratic deliberation requires. Instead of engaging with the substance of political disagreements, they retreat into ideological camps that reinforce their existing beliefs. This explains why contemporary political discourse often resembles warfare more than deliberation. When people lose the capacity for judgment, they can only choose sides rather than thinking through issues together. Political differences become matters of identity rather than occasions for collective thinking about common problems. Recovery of political judgment requires what I call thinking without banisters, the willingness to approach political questions without the comfort of ideological guidelines. This doesn't mean abandoning all principles or criteria, but rather developing the capacity to think each situation through on its own terms while remaining open to being surprised by human complexity. Chapter 6: Power versus Violence. Why neither side understands authority. One of the most revealing aspects of left-right politics is how both sides fundamentally misunderstand the nature of political power and authority. The left conflates all authority with oppression, while the right conflates power with force. Both confusions prevent them from recognizing what legitimate authority looks like and how genuine political power actually functions. Power, properly understood, emerges when people act together in concert. It belongs to groups, not individuals, and it cannot be stored or possessed like a physical object. Power appears whenever people gather together and disappears when they disperse. This is why tyrannies, despite their apparent strength, are actually powerless. They rely on violence to compensate for their lack of genuine power. The left typically treats all power as inherently suspicious, viewing it as something that oppresses rather than enables human action. But this conflates power with violence or domination. True political power liberates human capacity for action by creating stable institutions within which people can appear before one another as unique individuals. Without power, there is no politics, only the realm of private necessity or the chaos of violence. The right makes the opposite error by confusing power with force or authority with mere command. Conservative politics often appeals to strong leadership or law and order, without recognizing that genuine authority cannot be imposed from above. When authority must rely on force to maintain itself, it has already ceased to be authority and become mere violence. Consider how this plays out in contemporary debates about government authority. Progressives tend to view governmental power as legitimate only when it serves redistributive or regulatory purposes they support. But they become suspicious of the same governmental power when it operates in ways they oppose. Conservatives show the mirror image of this confusion, supporting governmental authority when it enforces traditional values, but opposing it when it challenges established arrangements. Both sides miss the crucial point that legitimate political authority derives neither from ideological correctness nor from traditional precedent, but from the ongoing consent and participation of citizens. Authority loses its legitimacy not when it fails to conform to our preferred political program, but when it can no longer rely on the free support of those subject to it. During my years studying American political institutions, I observed how the Constitution represents a rare example of legitimate authority. Its authority derives not from its age or its ideological content, but from the ongoing willingness of Americans to found their political life upon it. This founding was itself an act of power, people coming together to create something unprecedented in the world. But both left and right politics threaten this constitutional authority by treating it instrumentally. The left wants to interpret the Constitution as a vehicle for achieving social justice, while the right wants to preserve it as a bulwark against change. Both approaches subordinate constitutional authority to their respective political programs rather than recognizing it as the foundation that makes their political disagreements possible in the first place. The confusion of power with violence has particularly dangerous consequences in our time. When people believe that political power necessarily involves domination, they become suspicious of all collective action and retreat into private life. This leaves the field open for those who genuinely do confuse power with violence. Demagogues who promise to solve political problems through force rather than through the difficult work of building consensus. Neither left nor right politics can address this crisis because both operate with faulty concepts of power and authority. The left's suspicion of authority makes it incapable of building lasting institutions, while the right's confusion of authority with force makes it vulnerable to authoritarian appeals. Both contribute to the erosion of legitimate political authority by failing to understand how it actually functions. Recovering legitimate authority requires us to distinguish clearly between power and violence, between authority and force, between politics and administration. These distinctions cannot be grasped through ideological thinking, but require careful attention to how political relationships actually work in practice. Chapter 7: The Possibility of Politics Beyond Left and Right. Despite the dominance of left-right thinking in contemporary political life, politics itself remains possible, but only if we can recover our understanding of what political action actually involves. Politics is not about implementing ideological programs, but about creating and maintaining spaces where human beings can act together in their full plurality and uniqueness. The recovery of politics requires what I call thinking without banisters, approaching political questions without the comfort of predetermined ideological positions. This doesn't mean abandoning all principles or criteria for judgment, but rather developing the capacity to think each situation through on its own terms while remaining responsive to the unexpected possibilities that emerge from human action. Real political thinking begins with attention to the particular circumstances before us rather than with abstract theories about human nature or historical development. When we encounter rising authoritarianism, for instance, we must examine how it actually functions in our specific context rather than applying ready-made analyses derived from left or right ideological positions. Authoritarianism threatens politics itself, not just particular policy preferences. This approach reveals possibilities that ideological thinking obscures. Citizens who disagree profoundly about social and economic questions might discover common ground in their commitment to preserving the conditions for political life itself. A conservative who values tradition and a progressive who values change might both recognize that genuine politics requires institutions stable enough to enable innovation and flexible enough to accommodate human plurality. The American founding represents one historical example of politics beyond ideological categories. The founders disagreed about many fundamental questions: the role of government, the nature of representation, the relationship between federal and state authority. But they shared a commitment to creating institutions that could contain their disagreements productively rather than resolving them through force or administrative decree. This founding was itself an act of political power, people coming together to create something unprecedented in the world. They drew on various traditions and theories, but they subordinated these influences to the practical task of creating workable institutions for collective action. The result was neither conservative nor progressive in any ideological sense, but rather a framework for ongoing political life. Such founding moments remind us that humans possess what I call natality, the capacity to begin something genuinely new in the world. This capacity cannot be reduced to either left or right political programs because it transcends all predetermined categories. When people act together politically, they create possibilities that could not have been anticipated by any theoretical framework. The cultivation of this capacity requires institutions that protect and encourage political participation without determining its outcomes in advance. This means creating spaces for public deliberation, protecting the plurality of voices and perspectives, and maintaining the distinction between politics and administration. None of these institutional requirements can be derived from either left or right ideology. Contemporary political movements that transcend left-right categories often emerge around specific issues that require fresh thinking. Environmental challenges, technological disruption, or threats to democratic institutions can bring together people who disagree about traditional political questions but share concern about preserving conditions for human flourishing. These movements point toward possibilities for political renewal that neither left nor right thinking can fully comprehend. The recovery of politics also requires recognizing that political life has intrinsic, rather than merely instrumental value. People need opportunities to act together not just to solve problems, but to actualize their distinctly human capacities. When we treat politics merely as a means to achieve predetermined ends, we lose sight of why political life matters in the first place. This doesn't mean abandoning concern with practical outcomes or retreating into pure proceduralism. Political action inevitably creates new realities in the world, and these realities matter enormously for human welfare. But the value of politics cannot be reduced to its instrumental effects, because political participation itself represents one of the fundamental ways humans realize their potential. The path beyond left and right requires us to think more carefully about what we actually want from political life and what conditions make genuine politics possible in the modern world. Conclusion: the rejection of both left and right politics is not a retreat from political engagement, but a call for deeper political thinking. These ideological categories prevent us from seeing what politics actually is and what it can accomplish when freed from predetermined programs and ready-made solutions. Politics begins where ideology ends, in the space where people come together to deliberate and act despite their differences. It requires institutions that protect human plurality while enabling collective action, judgment that responds to particular circumstances rather than applying universal rules, and the recognition that political life has value beyond its instrumental uses. The crisis of contemporary democracy stems partly from our inability to think politically beyond left-right categories. When we reduce complex human realities to ideological positions, we lose our capacity for the kind of discrimination and judgment that democratic life requires. We become incapable of recognizing when our own principles conflict with political reality or when our opponents raise valid concerns. Recovery of political life requires what every generation must accomplish anew: the creation of institutions and practices that preserve space for human action while responding to the unprecedented challenges of our particular historical moment. This work cannot be accomplished through the application of either left or right ideology, but only through the difficult practice of thinking and acting together as political equals. The human capacity for new beginnings, what I call natality, remains our greatest political resource. In every crisis, this capacity offers the possibility of creating something genuinely unprecedented in the world, something that transcends the tired alternatives of left and right and opens new possibilities for human flourishing.